B. So, of course, of course, the relative gain is different for different strategy profiles chosen by the two nations, and each nation would try to maximize its own gain, right? So, nation A reasons as follows: if B disarms, then it's better for me to arm. So nation A will reason as follows: if B arms, so we are looking at this column, it is better for me to arm, okay? Because if B arms, then the possible strategies of A will lead it to these two possible entries from the payoff matrix, and of course, and A's gain in the two possibilities are given by the first coordinates. So, of course, the first coordinate is being 2 is bigger than in this case, and you check that the strategy recommended for A is arm. Okay. Similarly, if B disarms, which is this column, then of course, again you look at so these are the two possibilities for A, and of course, the gain for strategy A is 4, whereas the gain for A in strategy arm is 4, whereas the gain for A in strategy disarm is 3. So, of course, arming gives A more gain, so naturally the choice is again to arm. So, if B arms, it is better for A to arm. If B disarms, it is still better for A to arm. So, the dominant strategy for A is to arm, and likewise, if you can do the same analysis for B, and you will notice that the dominant strategy for B also is to arm. Okay. So, although in general, from the outside perspective, of course, it is if they both disarm, then it's probably better for them, right? It does not. It puts less pressure on their budgets and has various other benefits. So the issue is the lack of trust. So A doesn't know what is going to be B's choice, and B doesn't know what is going to be A's choice. So exactly the similar kind of situation that we saw in the case of prisoner's dilemma, where both of them, where the solution which would have been mutually beneficial for both of them, which is if both of them do not confess and get just a light 6 months jail term, is sort of not the game theoretically optimal solution, and the game theoretically optimal solution is for both of them to confess, in which they will both get 8 years in prison, right? There is exactly a similar kind of scenario, and we also discussed in the last lecture that the reason for this, for not reaching this nice solution, is that both the prisoner A doesn't know what prisoner B is going to do, and prisoner B doesn't know what prisoner A is going to do. So there is lack of information and there is lack of trust. So similarly, in the arms race also there is a lack of trust and a lack of complete information. That's why foreign diplomacy is important. Okay. Any questions about the arms race? Okay. So let us talk about another game, which is advertising. So companies A and B can choose to advertise or not advertise. So of course, company A and B, as we envisage, they are competing in the same market with a very similar kind of product, and in a sense they are in a trade war with each other, and both of them would like to sort of gain the market for their own product. So, so of course, if they want to gain market share for their product, then they would like to advertise, but there are certain costs to advertising, which is the very substantial money which you have to pay the various media organizations in order to advertise. So the other option is not to advertise, which cuts down on the budget for advertising, right? Because so the advertising money is just being given, it's just lost to the media organization. They not for production or sales or anything. It's just money that is going for the ad campaign, right? So ideally, they would like to just build the products and sell them without bothering to have to advertise. But since there is another competitor in the market, they are under pressure and they think that it might be beneficial to advertise. So what is the best policy? So this is modeled by this game, which is again given by a payoff matrix, and these the payoffs gains of the various players by taking the different combinations of strategies is given here. So the first coordinate refers to the gain by company A, the second coordinate refers to the gain by company B. So if they both advertise or if they both do not advertise, then they are in a kind of a deadlock. Whereas if one of them advertises and the other does not advertise, then the company which does not advertise loses and the company which does advertise gains very substantially, right? So that's kind of natural from a logical point of view, because if you and both advertise, if company A and company B both advertise, then they are in a kind of a deadlock because the people are getting both their informations. If both of them do not advertise, then also it's kind of even Stevens because people are not getting extra information from any of them, so they are not. People are not tilted or biased in any way towards buying the products of one company over the other. But if one of them advertises and the other doesn't advertise, then clearly one company is not reaching out to the people with their products, whereas the other company is advertising heavily, so they have an open field and they gain massively. Okay, while the company which doesn't advertise loses. So if with the above payoff matrix, let's calculate the possibilities for A. So when the strategists for company A will be thinking, they will be thinking in the following way. They will be reasoning in the following manner. Suppose company B advertises, then if company A advertises also, it gains 5. If A doesn't advertise, it loses 2. So in the event that B advertises, the obvious choice for company A should be to advertise, right? Wow. Now let us take, so this is in the event that B advertises. In the event that B doesn't advertise, then let us see what's happening. So this is, if B doesn't advertise, then we are talking about this column. So if B doesn't advertise, then A gains by advertising, and it's kind of even Stevens by it gains less by not advertising. So again, if B doesn't advertise, even then the better choice for A is to advertise. So in other words, advertising is the dominant strategy for A. The dominant strategy for A is to choose to advertise, because dominant strategy means that whatever be the choice of B, whatever be the choice of strategy made by B, advertising always brings more gain for A. Okay, so the dominant, and similarly you can reason about B, and you will find that the dominant strategy each player is to advertise. Again, both of them would have benefited more by saving on advertising cost if they both decide not to advertise, because if both of them advertise, then of course both of them gain 5. Whereas if both of them did not advertise, they would gain 8 because they would have saved on the advertising cost. But the logic of the game and the game theoretic considerations sort of compel them to advertise. So that's why we find all kinds of companies advertising all kinds of products all the time. Okay. Any questions? So of course, not every game has a dominant strategy. We will study such games later. Okay. So let's take the example of the game called the Stag Hunt. So the famous excuse me, the famous French intellectual Jean-Jacques Rousseau described a situation in which two individuals go on a hunt. So of course, each of these people can individually choose to hunt a stag or hunt a hare. So of course, a stag is big and it's prestigious. A hare is like a small animal. So at the beginning of the hunting, it has every player has to decide what he wants to do. Okay, to try to hunt a stag or try to hunt a hare. Now, if an individual hunts a stag, they must have the cooperation of their partner in order to succeed, because it's harder to hunt a stag. An individual can get a hare by himself, so without depending on the help of the other person. But here is what a stag. Okay. So ideally, again, both the players should cooperate and they should hunt a stag, right? But let's see what happens. What happens from a game theoretic point of view. So this has been taken to be a useful analogy for social cooperation, such as international agreements on climate change. Okay, because so ideally all the countries should cooperate to sort of cut down on the emissions and have a nice climate. But the problem is that cutting down on emissions is also going to create difficulties for the economy. So people don't want to do it, and then it's a question of strategy, right, and game theory. So let's come back to the stag hunt game, and let's look at the payoff matrix. So what does the payoff matrix consist of? So if both people hunt a stag, then of course stag is very worth more and prestigious, so it's both of them gain 2. In some sense, that's the ideal scenario. If hunter A tries to go for the stag and hunter B tries to go for the hare, hunter A doesn't stand a chance to hunt the stag, because he doesn't have the cooperation of B. So hunter A doesn't get anything, but hunter B, well, a hare is a small animal, and as we discussed in the conditions of the game in the previous slide, an individual can hunt a hare just by himself without depending on the cooperation from the other player. So hunter A trying to hunt a stag is left high and dry without any hunt, because hunter B is not cooperating. On the other hand, hunter B just wants to get a hare, so he can do it all by himself without the need of any cooperation from A, so he gets 1, which is the price of a hare. So similarly, if the hunter A wants to hunt a hare, then if hunter B wants to hunt a stag, similarly he will be the loser, because B cannot actually successfully hunt the stag without A's cooperation, and A is going for the hare, so there is no cooperation from A, so B gets 0, whereas A, he can just get the small hare by himself, so he gets 1. And if both of them go for the hare, then both of them can individually get the hare, and both of them get 1. Okay. So there are 2 Nash equilibria, as we had discussed before, when both players cooperate and when both players do not cooperate, both players defect. Okay. And you can satisfy and you can check that the conditions for Nash equilibria are satisfied for these choices. So the stag hunt differs from the prisoner's dilemma. In the prisoner's dilemma, despite the fact that both the players not confessing is optimal, the only Nash equilibrium is when both players choose to confess. Okay. So here, for example, in some sense, the optimal situation is when both players decide to cooperate and both want to hunt a stag. So let's check that this is a Nash equilibrium. So suppose B sticks to so what do we need to check for Nash equilibrium? For Nash equilibrium, there is in order to check that a combination of strategies or a strategy profile is a Nash equilibrium, we need to check that if all the other players stick to their choices or stick to their strategies, then by changing the strategy by one player will lead to a loss for that player. Okay, so that's Nash equilibrium. So imagine that hunter. So let's look at 2-2, the stag strategy. So suppose hunter B sticks to his choice, then hunter A can either stick with stag and get 2, or he can switch his choice to here and get 1. So, of course, if hunter B sticks to his choice of hunting a stag, then by shifting the choice from stag to here, hunter A loses, right. Let us now do the other reverse situation, look at the reverse situation. So, suppose hunter A sticks to his strategy of trying to hunt a stag, and hunter B switches his strategy. So, if hunter B was also hunting a stag, he was getting 2. If hunter B now switches his strategy to a hare, he just 1, right. So, if A sticks to his strategy of hunting a stag, hunter B also loses by switching his strategy from stag to hare. So, in other words, stag is a strategy profile such that for any if any of the players sticks to the current strategy of hunting a stag, then the other player loses by switching his strategy from stag to hare. So, therefore, stag is a Nash equilibrium. So, let us take the other possibility, which is the hare strategy. So, is this a Nash equilibrium? So, let us check. So, suppose B sticks to his strategy of hunting a hare. So, we are looking at this column. If A, so when A also hunts a hare, he gets 1. If he switches his strategy to trying to hunt a stag, he drops to 0. So, of course, A loses by switching his strategy from hare to stag if both of them were going for hare in the first place and B sticks to his strategy. Similarly, you can check that if both of them were going for hare in the first place, and if A sticks to his strategy of trying to hunt a hare, then B loses by switching to a stag. Okay? So, hare is also a Nash equilibrium. So, that is why there are 2 pure strategy Nash equilibria when both players cooperate and both players defect. So, the stag hunt there differs from the prisoner's dilemma if you remember from the last lecture, we saw that although there was the most beneficial or the optimal solution for both the players not to confess, the only Nash equilibrium was for both the players to confess. So, here it's a different kind of scenario. Okay? So, here both players cooperating, so both players choose stag is a Nash equilibrium, as well as both players choosing hare is also a Nash equilibrium. Okay? So, what is any questions? Okay. So, let us now talk about zero sum games. So, what is a zero sum game? So, a zero sum game is a game where the sum of the players, sum of the payoffs for the 2 players is 0 for each box. So, it's a game where it's like you must have heard the word zero sum game in many sort of general contexts, not necessarily mathematical contexts, because the phrase zero sum game is very often used in literature or newspapers or stories and blogs and things like that. So, basically it refers to a scenario where if you and I are playing this game, then whatever you lose I gain, and whatever I lose you gain. So, your loss is my gain, my loss is your gain. Okay? So, that is kind of a zero sum game. So, if you think of the payoffs, then of course your loss is my gain. So, if you lose L denoted by minus L, then I gain plus L, right, and so on. So, all the sort of combinations of payoffs for any strategy profile will look like this: one coordinate, and then the second coordinate being the negative of the first coordinate if there are 2 players, and the sum of the sum is 0. It's constant, and the sum is constant, and in particular 0. So, in that sense, you can just in some sources or some books, they just use the payoff for the player 1 for describing the payoff matrix, because you know implicitly that if this is the payoff for player 1, then the total payoff will look like this, right? So, because the second coordinate has to be the negative of the first coordinate, so the total payoff must look like this. So, you can just read of the total payoff, the total payoff matrix, the full payoff matrix, where every entry is a pair of the payoffs for each player, by just looking at these sort of more concise payoff matrix, where you are just only given information about the payoffs or the gains of the first player. Okay? But in our discussions, we will try to make the payoff as clear as possible. So, here is another example. This is an example of price wars. So, two mineral water companies X and Y have a fixed cost of 5,000 per month. They compete for the same market and must decide to charge either $1 or $2 per bottle. The rules of the game are, at $2, 5,000 bottles can be sold, because if it is more pricey, then less people will buy it. So the total revenue, 5,000 bottles and $2 per bottle, is 10,000, right? $10,000, 10K. At $1, 10,000 bottles can be sold, so the total revenue is also 10K. If they charge the same price, they split the market evenly. And if A charges more than B, then B gets the whole market and A gets nothing. And similarly, if B charges more than A, then A gets the whole market and B gets nothing. And the payoff for every company is total revenue it gains by selling these bottles minus 1,000, which is the production cost. Okay. So what is this game? So this game consists of two companies, A and B. So it has produced a bunch of water bottles at the cost of $5,000. Now there are two possible prices corresponding to two possible strategies for the two companies, to sell each bottle at $1 and or to sell each bottle at $2. If they sell each bottle at $2, so the total revenue, if they can capture the entire market, then the total revenue is the same. Okay, but the point is that since there are two companies, if both of them charge the same price, they split the market evenly. But if one of them charges more than the other, then the person who charges more loses the entire market, and the other person gets just completely captures it. So the payoff for every company is going to be the total revenue minus the expenditure, which is $5,000. So we will analyze this game. We will write down the payoff matrix and analyze the best strategies for the different companies. But first we will take a 10-minute break, and we will continue with the discussion of the game of price wars after the break. Okay, so let us go back to the game of price wars, which we were discussing just before the break. So, so here is the payoff table for the price wars. So, if both of them sell at if both of them decide to sell at $1, then each of them get to sell 5,000 bottles, because they then in total the total market is 10,000 bottles. They split it equally because they are selling at the same price. So each of them sells 5,000 bottles each out of this 10,000 at $1. So each of them gets revenue 5,000, but production cost is also 5,000. So each of them gains 0. Similarly, if both of them sell at $2, 5,000 bottles are sold in total. So since they are selling at the same price, both of them split this total market into halves. So both of them sell 2,500 bottles each. At $2, 2,500 bottles will bring them revenue $2 times 2,500, which is 5,000. But again, production cost is 5,000, so the total payoff or the total gain is 0 for both the companies. Now, what happens when one of them sells at $1, the other sells at $2? If one of them sells at $1, if both of them sell at, if the two companies sell at different price, then the company charging the lower price captures the entire market, and the higher priced company gets nothing. So if one of them sells at $1, the other at $2, the one selling at $1, the company selling at $1 captures the entire market. So at $1, 10,000 bottles can be sold. So the total revenue is $1 times 10,000. So the total revenue is 10,000. 5,000 is production cost. So the gain is 10,000 minus 5,000, which is 5,000. Okay. On the other hand, the other company which bid a bigger price gets nothing. So it doesn't get to sell any bottles. So the total revenue is 0, whereas the production cost is 5,000. So the payoff, which is the revenue minus the production cost, is minus 5,000. Okay. So similarly, you can calculate the payoff for the other eventuality when this company sells at $1, whereas the other company sells at $2. Okay. So this is how the payoff matrix will look like, and you can calculate the complete payoff matrix from the description, from the data that you are given. So notice that this is a zero sum game. Why? Because the sum of the payoffs for the two players is equal to 0 in all possible strategy profiles. Okay, under all possible strategy profiles. So you can also simplify the payoff matrix, because it's a zero sum game. You can just write down the payoff for the company X, and that will give you the complete information, because it's a zero sum game, right? So you can just condense the payoff matrix in terms of the payoff for company X in this form. But let us now go on to analyze this payoff matrix. So first do the following analysis, which is called the worst case analysis. So for each of your available strategies, determine the worst possible payoff. Then pick the strategy that maximizes your worst possible payoff. Okay. So think in terms of company X. So let me just clear this. Think in terms of company X. For every possible strategy, so each strategy for company X corresponding to a row of the payoff matrix. So, for every row of the payoff matrix, that is for each particular strategy of the chosen by player X, you calculate the worst possible payoff. So, for example, if you are looking at this row, then the worst possible payoff, the possible payoffs for A are 0 and 5,000. So, the worst possible payoff is obviously 0. So, you calculate the worst possible payoff for each row or for each strategy of player X, and then you choose the strategy which maximizes this worst possible payoff, right. So, in some sense, it's a max min kind of situation where you are first minimizing over every row, and then you are taking the maximum of these minimum payoffs over the rows, right. So, so this is called the worst case analysis. So, for each of your available strategies, determine the worst possible payoff, that is the minimum payoff, and then pick the strategy S that maximizes your worst payoff. Okay. So, what is the benefit of doing that? If you pick the strategy S, then you are guaranteed to get at least P, which is the if the maximum of these worst payoffs is P, then if you play according to the strategy S, you are guaranteed to get at least P. And this is the absolute minimum payoff that you can get if you play strategy S. And of course, if your opponent plays the wrong move, you can only improve upon your payoff from P upwards. Okay, is it clear? Okay. So, so here is how the company X reasons according to the worst case analysis. So, if the company A plays strategy 1, then the two possible payoffs are 0 and 5,000. So, of course, the worst possible payoff is 0. If the company plays strategy 2, then the two possible payoffs are minus 5,000 and 0. So, obviously, the worst possible payoff is minus 5,000. So, now it just compares the two worst possible payoffs from the two possible strategies. The worst possible payoffs in strategy $1 is 0. The worst possible payoff in strategy $2 is minus 5,000. So, of course, if it wants to maximize the worst possible payoff, then it must go with strategy 1 and it will get 0 payoff. Okay? But according to the worst case analysis, this is the best it can do. So, according to the worst case analysis, the player X would pick to sell for $1. So, okay, so is it clear, the worst case analysis? Okay. So, in this example, likewise company Y, you can also do a similar analysis for company Y, and you will also come to the conclusion that just like selling at $1 was the strategy of choice for company X from the worst case analysis. Similarly, worst case analysis will tell company Y that selling at $1 is also the best strategy for him. So, so because this is the worst case scenario gives this result for both the companies. So, both companies will end up selling at $1. Okay, and so that is why in price wars between companies, it's often the case that often you see that after all the considerations are taken into account, various companies seem to try very hard to push down their prices as much as possible, right? And essentially this kind of behavior stems from this sort of analysis. But this example of two companies and the worst case analysis also brings us to the concept of saddle points. So, what is a saddle point? So, let us first try to understand where the name comes from. So, I hope all of you know what a saddle is. So, the English word saddle. So, saddle is basically, so when you are riding a horse, on the back of the horse there is some sort of a seat, okay, and the seat on which the horse rider sits, and this seat on the back of a horse is called a saddle, and it's not a flat seat. in fact, it is shaped something like this, the picture that we have on the slide. Okay? So, it is sloping upwards along the spine of the horse and sloping downwards on the side of the horse. So, sloping upwards along the spine, sloping downwards along the side. Okay? So, you can imagine that there is some horse here. Okay? So, this is the maximum of my drawing abilities. So, I hope your imagination can fill up the blanks. Okay? So, let me quickly erase the evidence of my drawing. Okay. Now, back to business. So, the strategy profile 1-1 in this game is called a saddle point of the game. So, a saddle point is mathematically speaking, a saddle point on a surface, imagine the saddle on the back of the horse as a surface, is a point which is minimal in one direction. So, if you go, look at it along the spine of the horse, of course, this is a minimal point, but is maximal in another perpendicular direction. So, of course, if you look along the side of the horse, along this profile, along the horizontal profile, it is the maximum, but along the vertical profile, along the spine of the horse, it is the minimum, right? So, this point, this is pretty much where the rider sits. So, so here are some observations on the saddle point using the zero-sum game payoff matrix. So, this is just the payoff matrix written in the simplified form. So, notice, so what was the strategy 1-1? How did we arrive at this strategy? So, this was excuse me. This was minimum. So, if you look at it from the point of view of player X, it is you first took the minimum along the rows and then took the maximum of these minima along in the vertical direction, right? So, in the horizontal direction you first minimize and then among these horizontal minima in the vertical direction you maximize, right? So, it is exactly minimizing in one direction, maximizing in the perpendicular direction. So, in the simplified payoff matrix of a zero-sum game, an entry is a saddle point if it is simultaneously a minimum in its row and a maximum in its column. So, you see that here it is minimum in its row, maximum in its column. So, at saddle points, no player wants to change, it is an equilibrium, because of course, as soon as one player wants to change, he will do badly in terms of the worst case analysis that we discussed. So, no player wants to change and it is an equilibrium in the sense that both players, if somehow both the players arrive at this combination of strategies, then there is no incentive for either of them to change. Okay? So, saddle points may not be unique. So, for example, there are 4 saddle points in the following payoff matrix. So, it is a light exercise for you to find out what are these 4 saddle points. A12 is one of them. Okay? So, it is of course the minimum in its row and the maximum in its column. Okay? So, for example, if you look at A32 also, it is minimum in its row and maximum in its column, right? So, so there can be multiple saddle points in a game. So, and then there can be some games which have no saddle points. So, here is an example. So, here in this game with this particular payoff matrix, you can do a case by case analysis for all the possible strategy profiles and you will see that there is no saddle points. Similarly, the much simpler game, which is the game of matching pennies, has no saddle points either. So, so this is all that we had about saddle points, and this brings us to our discussion on the first part of game theory, which is also the discussion which we are going to have until the recess week, and we will reconvene after the recess week to complete the remaining part of game theory and continue on to other topics.